She flattened her palm against the rock, soaking in its strength and listening to its ancient story. For thousands of years, it stood witness to the rising sun and moon, to the rain-soaked fields and trees that stretched out their roots into the soil. It had given way to the river to allow life to reach the lands far to the south and beyond its sight. It had even survived the great battle that turned those fertile fields and forests into a wasteland of ash and dust until nothing else remained. Then the hills turned into dunes, and it became a monument in the desert, standing that way until the others came. It had known storms of water and thunder, storms of wind and sand, and had endured them all. Then the others came with their axes and shovels and carved it to pieces, building temples and walls out of the ruins. But they gave it a name. They called it the Hollow Cliffs.
Hi everyone, I'm Nikki, the author.
And I'm Mina, the friend that's never read the book.
Welcome to Behind the Quill, the podcast that takes you on a behind-the-scenes journey into the minds of writers. Hosted by me, Nikki Willcome, and Mina Pro, this show dives deep into the creative process, revealing the stories, struggles, and secrets behind the pages.
Whether you're a writer yourself, a book lover, or just curious of how stories come to life, join Nikki and myself, Mina Pro, as we chat with authors, share experiences, and explore everything that goes into making magic with words.
In every episode, we'll be pulling back the curtain to reveal the highs, lows, and plot twists of the writing life. From the spark of inspiration to the final draft, no part of the process is off limits.
So grab your favorite pen, a cup of tea, and get ready for an intimate and candid look at what happens behind the quill.
Welcome back to another episode of Behind the Quill. I'm your co-host, Nikki.
And I'm Mina Pro. Last time we introduced your books from An Empyrian Odyssey. So today we're diving into the fascinating process of fantasy world building. Nikki, creating your entire worlds from scratch really must have been an incredible process and experience for you. How do you even begin that?
It's definitely a journey. I start with a broad concept of the world. I think about the basic structure, like geography, cultures, and the general rules of the world. It's about setting the stage for everything that will unfold in the story. That's where I begin. I think it's so fun too, especially with serial writing, because then you can add and expand your world as you go and explore new places that can impact your characters.
That sounds like a real massive task, if you ask me. Do you use any specific techniques or tools to help you stay organized with your ideas?
Yep, absolutely. I rely on a combination of maps and notes and sometimes even AI to help me conceptualize some of my ideas. Creating a visual representation helps me keep everything straight. Like I talked last time in the last episode about creating those YouTube ambiance videos. Those are just images on the screen that help me get back into that world. I also have files on my computer full of these little details, and then I have giant cork boards at home filled with...
I've seen the cork boards. You look like you're hunting down a murderer.
Sometimes almost hunting down the villains. We got to figure out how.
Post-it notes that have little lines that connect to other post-it notes. It looks like a murder mystery on your board.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it does.
So maps sound like a really great tool. How detailed do you really get with your maps and the histories behind each one of these worlds?
Pretty detailed, but not too much where I feel boxed in. You know, I love books that have maps in them right away in the beginning. So it was important for me to include one in mine so the readers can orient themselves in the world. And me too. It's crucial for consistency and to make the world feel alive. I detail the geography like mountains, rivers, and cities. And I also dive into the history of the world, knowing key events and how they shape the current story.
I always like seeing the maps in the front of books too. It really helped create a mental visual.
Yes.
To be able to kind of create those pictures in your minds. So speaking of the history, how do you ensure the worlds feel cohesive and even believable?
So building the world the right way is the key. Every element from the magic system to the political structures needs to make sense within the world you create. I make sure that everything follows the established rules and logic, because if something magical comes out of left field, it's going to feel very awkward for the reader, right? Like with Harry Potter, we'll use an easy example. Magic is very much in play from the very beginning. It's right there, right in the very first chapter. You know what you're getting into. My first book, The Dark Solstice, isn't very magic heavy starting out, but I build up to it in ways that make it so when it is revealed, it doesn't feel out of place. I weave it into the culture, the histories of the people. Tamsin comes from a very non-magical place, sort of like us in the real world. But when she moves to Empyria, things start to change. Religion is still practiced in Empyria, and it's not in the cities, and that's where Tamsin is originally from. It's been banned, but not in Empyria. And though that's not necessarily a magical element to someone like Tamsin, who comes from a place where it's been banned for hundreds of years, it almost feels that way. And then when the Medines show up, who are even more mysterious and culturally different, it brings up more elements from their history and their mythology, and those elements actually have real weight in their world, especially for the Watchers who possess abilities because of the world around them. And I won't do spoilers for that. You'll have to read it to know what their abilities are.
So how do you balance the need for a rich, immersive world with the story that you're trying to continue on and tell?
It's about finding that sweet spot where the world enhances the story without overshadowing it. The world should serve the story, providing context and depth, but the characters and their journeys are always at the forefront. If you info dump all of your world building at the beginning, you're going to lose the reader. I think the best way is to reveal parts of your world as your characters go along. Allow your reader to experience it as your character does. And this helps keep the pace of the story going too. You don't want it to slow down too much with all these lengthy descriptions of trees and mountains.
Not like Lord of the Rings where we get a full chapter on a door.
Oh, yes. I've read Lord of the Rings. It's very...
very descriptive.
I love it, but it's very descriptive. Yes, Tolkien can go on for pages describing a tree, and that's great for him, but that's not for me.
Do you ever find yourself getting lost sometimes in those details of your worlds?
Oh, all the time. And it can be both like a blessing and a curse. It's like that image of the glacier that's out there, or the iceberg, where the part that's above water is what makes it into the book and what the reader gets. And then there's a whole mountain underneath the water, and that's all the information the author knows about the world. It's so true, which is why it's important to know when to pull back and focus on the narrative. Like I said, world building should support the story, not drown it out.
That's why we have fan fictions and short stories and little things like that. So if you want more meat about the background, you can find it there, not in the main book. We ain't got time for that.
That would be one of my super goals, is if, not for myself, but if one day a fan of my books created fan fiction about it, then I know I've made it.
Then you've made it. You've gotten to that point.
Mhm.
So that's all really great advice. Can you give us an example of a world building element from An Empyrian Odyssey that you're really particularly proud of?
So the one I'm most proud of, I guess, would be the marshlands. Probably because I did the most research on that one. I did a lot of research about the Middle East for this because they have some older cultures there that I kind of modeled the Medina off of. But it's not just a physical landscape, but it has its own history, its culture, and legends that influence the plot and the characters significantly. It's a character in its own right. But yeah, so.
Was there one that you had the most difficulty creating?
The one I had the most difficult was probably the mangroves. And that one is in the Hour of Embers in the second book. It was also probably the most fun, purely because of the way it affects one of the characters. I'll just say it's Tamsin. It was a late addition to the story, but I needed something to challenge Tamsin in a more personal way. Something that she had to overcome on her own, and it was very much tied into the fabric of the landscape itself. But it also became an important place in the Medine's culture as well. It's very much an elephant graveyard, from the Lion King type of place. You never go there, Simba. So
and hashtag we're moms.
Yeah. So yeah, it was pretty fun to play around in that place, and it actually became one of the pivotal points in that story.
Do you think your interest originally when you were back in college of majoring in environmental conservation has helped you in creating these worlds?
Oh, I'm sure it has. Like, I love animals. I love the environment. I still want to, go out and save all the little critters. But, so just getting to incorporate some of those elements in my stories to really bring it to life is important to me.
Kind of helps you with a background to create more connections of how the landscape and the animals and everything would interact with each other with already having some of that interest.
Yeah, definitely.
So you said that there's tons of myths and legends at play. Do you ever include myths or legends within Empyria that play a significant role in the story?
Oh, yeah. There are several myths and legends that shape the characters and the plot. For instance, in the beginning, the Medine themselves are a people that have a mythical, mysterious air around them because no one has had contact with them in a long time. So it makes people quite nervous to be around them when they actually do show up, except for Tamsin, who knows nothing about them and hears nothing about them until she actually encounters them. So her opinion is completely based on her personal experience and not the stories that others will start to tell her. Tamsin's first encounter with them is actually pretty dangerous, and it's because of how that plays out is why she has such a level of trust with them, especially Haven, that isn't influenced by any predetermined prejudice. And I love a good prophecy. So, of course, I had to add some of those. The first one in particular that I did was really tricky, and it's spoken pretty early on in the story, and of course Tamsin doesn't believe it, like most of the characters that have had prophecies spoken about them in the first book, because it's not a credible thing in their society anymore. But it was tricky piecing it together because I didn't want to write myself into a corner, I think that's one of the worst things as a writer is writing yourself into a situation that you can't get out of. So I had to word it in a way that allowed me options going forward. And I mean, it's a prophecy. It's supposed to be mysterious and,
interpreted in many ways.
Yes, exactly.
So what do you do when or if you get stuck in a corner? You write yourself into a corner.
Well, if it's not published yet, you can go back and change it first if it's something you're still working on, which is great. Or you have to get creative as hell to figure out a way out of it that still makes sense. Because readers are smart. They'll smell an easy out a mile away. For example, if I had killed off a character at the end of book 1, but realized halfway through book 2 that I needed that character later on, well, now I'm stuck. You know, I can't bring that character back to life.
All these TV shows that magically somebody's not dead anymore.
Yes. Even though there's magic in my book, the magic doesn't work that way. I can't bring that character back to life unless I had set it up right in the previous book, you know? And sometimes you can get away with that if something happens off screen that your main character isn't a direct witness to or something like that. But you never get away with saying, oh, that person had a magic healing potion the whole time and now they're back.
So speaking of your characters, how do your characters interact with and shape the world around them?
So the characters are integral to the world building process. Their actions and decisions impact everything in the world significantly. For example, Tamsin's quest for knowledge about the Medine in the first book often leads her to uncover secrets, not just about the Medine, but about herself, which in turn reveals more about the world to the readers.
So did you have to create your own language for some of these cultures and characters?
For the Medine, yes, I did. And when I say yes, it's a loose yes, because it's nowhere near as extensive as, say, the Elvish language in Lord of the Rings, or something like that. I started off with a few simple words and phrases, but by the time the second book was well underway, I knew I needed to really hammer out some details for the language, because language needs rules and it needs to feel authentic to that world. Though Kip, my son, who's 7 now, comes home from school and sometimes asks me questions about something he's read or how to spell something, and sometimes he gets really mad if it doesn't follow the rules that he's learned in school for spelling, and he'll ask me why, and sometimes all I can do is shrug and say, language is a funny thing.
Mm-hmm.
You know, but I can't do that when I'm writing. You know, it's not how it works. I can't just shrug my shoulders and go, oh, well, I'll just throw in some random word and the reader won't care. No, they care. At least I hope they care.
They will care when you have the ones writing fanfics and learning the language.
Yes. Mm-hmm. So for the Medine language, I ended up basing it off of more of their religion and mythology. So they have the Katori in their mythology, which are like the 4 creators of their world. So using like the names of those gods, their deities, that's how I kind of branched off the language from there. So I really wanted it rooted
in their religion.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So let's talk about magic systems. How did you go about creating rules for magic in your world?
So I wanted magic to feel powerful, but also have its limits. You know, for the Watchers, their magical abilities are directly tied to another creature, the Amanji. And this is an ancient relationship, one that goes back in their mythology to when the gods were part of their world. But it's not the only way magic is present. For some of them, it's in their bloodline. And this adds a strategic layer to how some characters use their abilities. For Haven, this power is necessary. It's for survival. It's part of his role as a Watcher. But for him, what's interesting isn't that he has this ability, but how this propels his internal conflict. And if we can go back to the idea of prophecy for just a sec, within the magical realm of the world, this idea of prophecy and fate becomes bigger and more real as Tamsin discovers that there's more to the world than what she's been led to believe. And she has been led. It comes up repeatedly throughout the first 3 books, and it's really going to twist things up in book 4. the theme of fate and autonomy and whether or not it can be manipulated or changed.
If there is real free will or not. Okay. So on the opposite end of things, what role do economy and even politics play in Empyria?
So those definitely play a huge part in the story. Politics especially provides an outlet for many of the conflicts and motivations for some of these characters. In each realm, something different is going on, but they're each impacted by the other in some way. So they're not like separate entities. What's happening in one part of the world is somehow affecting another part of the world in different ways. In Empyria, for example, the political landscape goes through some major changes over the course of the first 3 books. The power shifts from the established system of 3 ruling lords governing the city to just one, as Cornelius takes over, one of our villains in there. And then finally to the people as the rebellion eventually succeeds. But their success very much hinged upon what was happening in the cities with Amelia and Lord Urbane and what was taking place there and the changes that political system was going through. There had never been a woman on the Lord's Council before, and that's the ruling council for all of the cities. And now there is. And going into the 4th book, you can imagine that's going to cause a lot of conflict.
Well, and like you said, one of your main characters comes from a culture that's very much male-led, male-ruled. So I'm sure there's lots of internal conflict there, having a woman step up in a place of power.
Oh, for sure. Because the cities in Empyria were supposed to be contrast mirrors to what was happening in the marshlands with Tamsin, because the Medine are ruled solely by women. It's a complete opposite from the cities. Aside from the Watchers, men have very little power there. There are 12 tribes, and each tribe is run by a Khazera, a female ruler. They each have dominion over their own tribe, but they do come together occasionally to discuss things for the Medine as a whole, like during the capoeira, the duels, which I think I mentioned before. And what happens here is interesting because the power starts to go in the opposite direction of what happened in Empyria. As Tamsin gains more followers and enlists more tribes to her cause to help rescue Haven, she gains more power and becomes this unifying figure. A lot of Tamsin's internal conflict in the 2nd book especially comes from this, because the idea of one person, let alone a woman, having complete control over a whole society is completely foreign to her. And suddenly she has thousands of lives in her hand. And then to add even more layers to it, you have characters like Numa and Rienne who are helping Tamsin with all of this, guiding her, and in some ways even making the decisions for her, because they've been in the outcast tribe for so long that they're going to have their own motivations. So yeah, and all that's just scratching the surface.
So how do you balance all these elements that you have at play to enhance your story?
So there's a lot of politics going on in the books. Like I said, there's something going on in each of the major realms. But if it was just politics, it wouldn't be much fun in a fantasy story. So I think adding those magical elements in there gives it a wild card factor. I'm not just interested in balancing out the page time between magic and politics. I want to see how the two affect each other and play off of each other.
That's really fascinating. Yeah. So before we wrap this up, for inspiring writers out there, what tips would you give them for effective world building?
So I would say start broad and then narrow down from there. Define the major aspects first of the world you want to create, the geography, the politics, the magic systems, and then slowly add layers of detail. Always think about how these elements affect your characters and the plot. If you're struggling with it, I'd say go back to the worlds that you personally love. reread your favorites and pay attention to how the author sets up the world and how they use it to serve their characters' inner conflicts. There's also tons of resources out there to help. I've watched N.K. Jemison's masterclass on world building. It's fantastic. Abby Emmons is another one on YouTube. I find it helpful sometimes just to go back and reread or re-listen to some of these things to make sure I'm keeping these elements in the back of my mind too as I'm writing.
That's excellent advice. Now, I wanted to end with another review from Ray Simmons about the dark solstice. This one says, this is an exceptional introduction to a series because it lays out the world so well. In the book that follows, why can I not read? Let's do that again.
You need to read more books.
Shh. Shush, Miss Nikki. Shush. I don't read. Here we go. In the books that follow it will be easy for the reader to just dive right in and enjoy.
Well, I think that's fitting for our world building episode. But yeah, one of the goals of creating a world like this is making it an immersive experience for the readers. So like you said, you can just dive in and enjoy it. And one little tag for world building, I'm going to throw a picture up in stories on the Instagram page about Miss Mina's studio here. She created a whole little world for us to do this
got
in.
Our own little pod world.
Yes, we do.
Well, that brings this episode to a close. Thank you so much, Nikki, for sharing your insights on world building with us.
Thank you, Mina. And thanks to all our listeners. Join us next time on Behind the Quill as we dive into character development. And please go over and check out Mina's podcast page to get updates on her podcast, In Studio with Mina Pro. Have a great week, everyone. Bye.
Bye.